Sunday school, I would hear the phrase, "We all know the story of," and I wouldn't know the story. And so I always felt like there was something that the people in the pews knew that I didn't. There was something that I was missing out on, because they would say that phrase and everybody would nod their heads and go, "Yep, I know that story. I know the story of Paul." And I'm going, "Paul, he wasn't one of the Bible story heroes. He wasn't on that Rolodex of VBS guys, right?" I have no idea who that is. And so I always felt like there was something that I was missing, that the person in that pew next to me was better than me. I wasn't good enough to sit in that pew because they knew something I didn't. And so I remember going home, and it started about the age of 11 or 12, and I know that because when I was 10, our house burned, and this church showed up and showed out. They showed up for us. I didn't have anything but the clothes on my back. And a few weeks later, we came here, and we had food and clothes and everything we needed, and this church did that. That's what community is. And they showed up for us, and one of the things I got that day was a red Bible, and it was a Bible from Liz Matthews and her family. And I remember them giving it to me, and starting at the age of 10, 11, 12, I would read it daily because that was the thing you were supposed to do, right? So I remember opening it up. It's a book, and I'm going to open it up to Genesis 1, and I'd start reading. And I'd read until I fall asleep that night, and then I'd pick it up the next day. Oh, I was somewhere in here, and I'd pick it up and I'd read it. But it wasn't sinking in. It wasn't making much sense to me. But I was doing the thing. I was checking the box. I was opening the book, right? So I remember getting to Leviticus. And again, this is at 11 and 12. Y'all, there are words in Leviticus that I did not know. 11 and 12, there are words that I didn't think should belong in the Bible, right? So I remember falling off there and going, maybe this isn't for me, and backing off for a few months. Okay, so then I'm probably 12, 13, and I come back at it, Genesis 1, page 1. And I'm reading the Bible. And I remember getting to Numbers. And I'm a little bit further, so I'm into Numbers, and I was convinced, I remember having this thought as a kid, that if I showed up to church on a Sunday morning, I could point to the person next to me and I could say, "How many people were in the tribe of Gad?" And they could rattle it off. That's what I thought. If you were here on a Sunday morning, you had that Bible memorized. So I'm reading this Bible, trying to memorize it, and y'all, it didn't go well. 11, 12, 13, didn't go well. So I give it up, come back, and I dive in. Genesis 1, chapter 1. Then I remember making it Kings. Now we're in late high school, early college. Still this little red Bible. Kings and Chronicles. Okay, I make it to Kings, and I remember reading about this King Jeroboam, and he did all these really cool things. And then I got to Chronicles, and there's this King Jeroboam, and he did all these really cool things. And I remember thinking, is this Jerry Jr.? Or was there a wrinkle in time that no one told me about? Did this happen twice? What is this? And so I remember literally throwing my hands up and going, this Bible is not for me. There is something in here that I can't figure out. I am not good enough. I'm not smart enough to figure out this Bible. And at this point, I've been at it for 10 years, and it's not making any sense. I'm doing the thing. I'm checking the box, and it's not making any sense. So I kind of gave up, and by the end of college, early married life, I started getting these text messages from Mr. Eddie Barnhill. And they would just be a Bible verse. And sometimes it would be once a day, once a week, once a month. Sometimes it would be in a group of people, a group chat, or sometimes it'd just be one-on-one. And he'd just send me a verse, just drop a message. And so I started taking that as my sign from God that I should be in my Bible that day. And so I'd take that verse that he sent me, and I'd find that chapter, and I'd read that chapter. Sometimes it made sense. A lot of times it didn't, because I didn't have the context. I didn't know who wrote the book, why they wrote the book, but I was reading the thing, I was doing the thing, right? And so my life really started to change when he would send me those verses, and I started talking with my husband, Coy, and saying, okay, we really need to get into church for the kids. I started thinking, oh, I'm good, right? I was raised in church. I am a Christian, and I know, but we need to get in church for the kids. So start talking about what church we want to go to, and we were wide open. Any denomination, any church, we were going to try it out, try with our friends. And then COVID happened. This was in 2019, and COVID happened in 2020, and it was the perfect excuse not to have to go to church, because some churches were meeting, some were changing their times. It was the perfect excuse not to go to church. So we postponed it. Then my life changed. January of 2021, at my kitchen island, my brother Ethan and his wife Haley come over to our house. They have this green book with them. And they said, yeah, we're going to Sunday school at First Baptist, and we're reading this Bible, and it's a 365-day Bible, and we're going to read it through in a year. Y'all, at this point, I am 31 years old, and I've been trying to do this for 20 years. I started at 11 years old trying to read this Bible. I had plan after plan. I had tried to take the number of pages in the book, divide by 365. Okay, you've got to read that many pages a day. Can y'all tell I'm a numbers person? I used to take the chapters. Okay, there's this many chapters in the Bible. I've got to read this many chapters per day to get through it in a year. I'd been doing that since I was 11 years old and hadn't made it past Kings and Chronicles because that wrinkle in time really threw me off. But they're coming to my house with this book, and they're just saying, yeah, we're reading it through in a year. And I thought, that's pretty cool. Been trying to do that. And he says, yeah, this past Sunday we were talking about Job. It's January. How are you talking about Job? I've been in Genesis 1 enough to know that he's not in the first 5 books of the Bible. I hadn't made it much further than that. But I know he's not in the first 5. How are you talking about Job in January? And he said, well, we're reading it through in chronological order. What? He said, yeah, we're reading it in the order that it actually happened. Y'all, I was 31 years old before I realized that the Bible is not in chronological order. It's not at all. It is organized like a library. You think if you want to go learn about the law, you go to the first 5 books of the Bible. You want to learn about the history, that's the next section. And then you've got the poetry and the major prophets and the minor prophets. It's organized by category. Not at all in the order that it actually happened. So I hope that helps somebody today because it took me 20 years to figure that out. But so we're talking about the Sunday school class, and then I say, okay, well, does Matthew, your teacher, he must have some study manual, and he shows up on Sunday and he opens up that book and he fires off questions to make sure you did your reading that week, right? He's going to quiz you. The gotcha moment. He said, no. He said, he's got the same book we do. He said, I'll underline stuff that I have questions on that don't make sense to me. And he said, or I'll highlight something that really spoke to me that week. And we just have a conversation. I'll bring it up in class and we just have a conversation. And we talk about it. And I thought, man, a Sunday school class where I can't be wrong. They're not going to see that I don't know this stuff. And they're going to be doing something I've been trying to do for 20 years. Maybe this is worth trying. So we decided to show up. And y'all, one of the first Sundays that we showed up, sitting across the table from me was Morgan Gooden. And if you all don't know Morgan, to me, she was the poster child for Sunday school. This girl had been here, okay? She was the person that's sitting next to she was one of the people that I was trying to be good enough to sit by in church. Because when they said the Bible story of so-and-so, she was on her head, and I was just convinced that she had the Bible memorized. And this Sunday, one of the first Sundays we showed up, we're sitting around the table, and she's sitting across the table from me, and she says, wow, I didn't know that. I'd never read that before. And I thought, you can do that? You can admit that you don't know something, and you're not going to get struck down in church? What? So that was life-changing for me, because she just admitted, and there were no giggles around the room. There was no condescending looks. It was a conversation, and you could admit you were wrong. You could admit that you didn't know something. And so that made me want to keep going. So fast forward to March of 2021. It's a Sunday before Easter. And my husband, Coy, was out of town, and I had every excuse not to go that day because I got 2 boys to get ready on my own. That's in and of itself. I could have said, nope, not going today. But we got up, we went. And the discussion that day, by the time I got to the class, I was actually late. And the Sunday school room is packed. All the tables are full. And I had to open a folding chair up against the back wall. And so I'm sitting in the back wall, and the discussion that day was on the 10 Commandments. And again, that's pretty early on in the Bible. I'd read it several times. Felt comfortable about that story. And so we're going through it, except what's different this time is two things. One, I'm reading it through in chronological order. So I've gotten to know the Father as a father rather than this mean dictator man being up in the sky somewhere. Now he's a father. It also helps that I'm now a parent. And y'all, as a parent, there are things that have come out of my mouth that I never thought I would have to say. Things like, don't put your bare butt on your brother's face. Those words have come out of my mouth. Y'all, multiple times, okay? I've had to say the words. And you're like, I never thought I would have to say those words, but I've done it. Okay. And now I'm viewing these 10 commandments as a loving father telling his kids. If you view them that way and you go, my children, don't murder each other. Like, just don't murder each other, right? You can see the love in that. But you can also, when you're reading it through chronologically, you can see these people just came out of years of slavery. And now one of his commandments, one of his laws is to rest. Take the Sabbath and rest. Take one day and spend time with your Father and be with me. That's a commandment. Does that sound like a mean dictator? Rest? So I'm viewing this in a completely different light. And that's the conversation that day. And y'all, at the end of that Sunday school lesson, Matthew Morrow asked a question that changed my life. He said, how do we get into heaven? Pretty simple. We were in a room full of Christians on a Sunday morning, right? And the room was packed. Remember, I'm up in this back corner. He asked a simple question, and the room was silent. Nobody said a word. So Big Mouth Brittany speaks up. And I said, well, you obey the 10 Commandments. That had to be the right answer. We talked about it all Sunday morning, right? You obey the 10 Commandments, and that's how you get into heaven. And he said, had the perfect response. He said, but what happens when you fail? I said, well, that's what repentance is, right? You pray the prayer. He uses a magic eraser and erases all the old things. And then you got to do better, be better to be good enough the next day. That was my understanding of the gospel, and that's where I went wrong. I said, you have to be good enough the next day. But I didn't have to wait very long because that exact same day, 20 minutes later, we come into this sanctuary. And we didn't have a pastor at the time, so the pastor was Pastor Dennis, and he gets up and he says, the title of my sermon today is How Good is Good Enough to Get into Heaven? Talk about a God thing. Y'all ever have one of those sermons that you're like, feels like a spotlight's on you? Like, he's talking to me, the rest of y'all can go home because this one's meant just for me. That was me on this Sunday morning. This message was 100% from God's mouth to my ears. And he said, how good is good enough to get into heaven? And he starts diving in and giving all these stats. And he said, he references Galatians, and he says, Galatians 3:10, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, because it is written, everyone who does not do everything written in the book of the law is cursed. Everything. Y'all, that's a lot of stuff. I've spent a lot of time in that law because that's Genesis 1. And so I was hooked. And then he says, okay, but so what's our standard? If we I just want to know the bare minimum. What's the bare minimum to get into heaven? How good is good enough? And he references Matthew 5:20. Jesus said this, for I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. Okay, well, what are the scribes? The scribes wrote scripture for a living. They wrote scripture all day, every day, had large sections of it memorized. You better than that? Can anybody raise their hand and say they're better than what the scribes would have been back in the day? Because I can't. What about the Pharisees? They had to know the law inside and out, and they had to enforce it. Y'all, there aren't just 10 commandments in the Old Testament. There's over 600. So you got to know. I don't even know them all, much less do I follow them all, right? So I'm not better than that. And he said, well, that's pretty clear. That's what it takes to get into the kingdom of heaven. And I went, uh-oh, that's not me. So he said, what's our standard? Well, Matthew 5:48, Jesus said, be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. There's your standard. If you're looking for a standard, a comparison, that's it. That's the bar. That's the bare minimum to get into heaven is perfection. Anybody raise their hand, say they're perfect? Anybody deserve to go to heaven after that message? I don't, right? So then he references James 10, and he says, for whoever keeps the entire law and yet stumbles at one point is guilty of breaking it all. Y'all, you don't get an 8 out of 10 on the commandments and go, oh, that's passing. You're good. Doesn't work that way. It's all or nothing. It's 100% or 0. You are either perfect or you're not good enough to get into heaven. So the problem that I'd had for 20 plus years was I'd been comparing myself to the person in the pew next to me. I've been trying to be good enough to sit next to that person in the pew on Sunday. I've been trying to be good enough to show up in that Sunday school classroom and have all the answers. Good enough wasn't going to cut it because they weren't my standard. That person sitting next to you in that pew is not your standard. Jesus is. Perfection is your standard. If you don't match that, you don't deserve it. So to bring this home, I'm going to tell you about a conversation I had with my kids, and this was in May of this year. And I had a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old at the time, and we're in bath time. And my 4-year-old is on one this night, y'all. He is splashing water out of the tub. He's hitting his brother over the head with a toy. I mean, it's just one of those nights. And I'm getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And I said, Coop, if you don't quit, you're going to spank him when you get out of this tub, and you're going to lose that TV time I promised you before bed. Cut it out. Didn't faze him. Kept on. I said, that's it. You're getting a spanking when you get out and no TV time. And as I'm getting angry, we talked about the Holy Spirit. And the way God speaks to me is kind of just a nudge. Like she said, it's kind of a thought that I know is not mine. And I had this thought, and it just said, teach them. Y'all, I want to be angry right now. I don't want to teach. I'm angry, but I'm hearing this, teach them. Okay, so I say, Carter, Coop, do you know what mercy and grace are? And they said, no. I said, well, mercy is not getting what you deserve. So if you go to get out of this tub and I say, come get this spanking, but I don't give you the spanking, that's mercy. You deserve it, but I'm not going to give it to you. Mom's showing you mercy. And I said, grace is even above and beyond that. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. So you don't deserve that TV time, but if Mama gave it to you, that's grace. So we have this conversation, and as this is happening, Carter comes out of left field, and he says, Mom, what are the 10 Commandments? So like any good millennial mom, I Google it. And I Google it, and I say, we read off the 10 Commandments, and we get to the end of that, and I said, Carter, man, I said, Mama's failed at most of those. His eyes get big. What? Mama's not perfect? I said, yeah, I've failed at most of those. I've told a lie. Have you ever lied? He said, yeah, me too. I said, I've been jealous of what someone else had. I've coveted. Have you ever done that? Yeah, me too. Well, God doesn't say that's not just a mistake or slip up. God calls them sins. And if you say, I just engaged in a little friendly gossip, no, God says that's slander, and that's a sin. Or I just stretched the truth a little bit, no, God says that's a lie, and that's a sin. And so I've committed those things. I have failed. So if the standard is perfection, Brittany's out. I've lost. I said, but I really want to go to heaven. I really want to. How do I get there? Carter says, Mom, I don't know. I said, okay. Imagine if Cooper, who deserves that spanking, goes to get out of this tub. I say, Coop, come here. Time for your spanking. daughter stands up. And he says, Mom, give me the spanking that my brother deserves. How much must a brother love you to take the punishment that you deserve? Y'all, that's what Jesus did. When he was on that cross, you know who he thought about? Me. You know who he thought? Me. He knew that Brittany was going to try for 20 years to be good enough, and she never was going to make it. She was never going to be good enough. So when he was getting beaten and a crown of thorns put on his head and spit on, you know who he was thinking about? You. He had your name on his mind, because that's why he went to that cross. He loved you so much that he took the punishment that you deserved. You deserved to be up there, and your brother loved you so much that he took that for you. How awesome is that? So what's the final step in that process? Step 1 is knowing that you don't deserve it. You got to understand that. The standard is perfection. If you're not there, you don't deserve that ticket to heaven. But here is the key. Ephesians 2:8, for you were saved by grace through faith. And it is not from yourself. There's nothing you can do to earn it, but it's God's gift. I mean, imagine him standing there with his arms open and going, my child, my sister, it's free. All you've got to do is accept it. That's what he did for us. That's the gospel message. And so I want to invite my prayer team down, and I just want to be available to pray with any and every one in here. I want to fill this altar up, and that doesn't mean that you haven't been saved. Come talk to him. Fill this altar up and talk to him and tell him, God, thank you. Thank you for sending your son to die for me when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for thinking of me when you were up on that cross. Thank you for that.